do you do when you just can't figure something out? For zombies, it's pretty simple. They can just keep bashing their brains against the wall. But living brains are a lot more complex. It turns out, though, that if you understand just a little bit of some of the basics about how your brain works, you can learn more easily and be less frustrated. Researchers have found that we have two fundamentally different modes of thinking. Here, I'll call them the focused and the diffuse modes. We're familiar with focusing. It's when you concentrate intently on something you're trying to learn or to understand. But we're not so familiar with diffuse thinking. Turns out that this more relaxed thinking style is related to a set of neural resting states. We're going to use an analogy of the game of pinball to help us understand these two thinking modes. Incidentally, both metaphor and analogy are really helpful when you're trying to learn something new. If you remember, a pinball game works by you pull back on the plunger, release it, and a ball goes boinking out, bouncing around on the rubber bumpers, and that's how you get points. So, here's your brain with the ears right here and the eyes looking upwards, and we can lay that pinball machine right down inside it. So there you go. There's the analogy for the focus mode. The blue rubber bumpers here are placed very close to one another. See the orange pattern here towards the top? It represents a familiar thought pattern, maybe involving something simple like adding some numbers, or more advanced ideas like literary criticism or calculating electromagnetic flux. You think a thought, boom, it takes off, moves smoothly along, and then as it's bouncing around on the bumpers, you're able to figure out the problem you're trying to solve or the concept you're trying to understand that's related to something you're rather familiar with. So look at how that thought moves smoothly around on the fuzzy underlying orange neural pathway. In some sense, it's as if it's traveling along a familiar, nicely paved road. But what if the problem you're working on needs new ideas or approaches, concepts you haven't thought of before? That's symbolized here by this neural pattern towards the bottom of the pinball machine area. But if you haven't thought that thought before, you don't even know how that pattern feels or where it is. So how are you going to develop that new thought in the first place? Not only do you not know where the pattern is or what the pattern looks like, but see all the rubber bumpers that are blocking your access, whatever direction you do decide to move in? To get to this new thought pattern, you need a different way of thinking, and that's represented here by the diffuse mode. Look at how widely spaced the rubber bumpers are. Thought takes off. Look at how it moves widely, bounces around. It can travel a long way before being interrupted by hitting a bumper. In this diffuse mode of thinking, you can look at things broadly from a very different big picture perspective. You can make new neural connections traveling along new pathways. You can't focus in as tightly as you often need to finalize any sort of problem solving or understand the finest aspects of a concept, but you can at least get to the initial place you need to be in to home in on a solution. Now, as far as neuroscientists know right now, you're either in the focus mode or the diffuse mode of thinking. It seems you can't be in both thinking modes at the same time. It's kind of like a coin. You can see either one side or the other side of the coin, but not both sides at the same time. Being in one mode seems to limit your access to the other mode's way of thinking. In our next video, we're going to see how some extraordinary people access their diffuse ways of thinking to do great things. Thanks for learning about learning. I'm Barbara Oakley. So let's take a look at some famous people from history who used their different thinking modes to help them with their problem solving. If you look at that guy right there, he was Salvador Dali, a very well-known surrealist painter of the 20th century. He was the very definition of a wild and crazy guy. You can see him here with his pet ocelot, Babu. Dali used to have an interesting technique to help him come up with his fantastically creative surrealist paintings. He'd relax in a chair and let his mind go free, often still vaguely thinking about what he had previously been focusing on. He'd have a key in his hand, dangling it just above the floor, and as he would slip into his dreams, falling asleep, the key would fall from his hand and the clatter would wake him up just in time so he could gather up those diffuse mode connections and ideas in his mind, and off he'd go back into the focus mode, bringing with him the new connections he'd made while in the diffuse mode. Now you might think, well, that's okay for an artist. But what does it have to do with more scientific or mathematical kinds of thinking? Well, if you look down here, this guy was Thomas Edison, one of the most brilliant inventors ever. According to legend, what Edison used to do was he'd sit and relax in his chair, holding ball bearings in his hand. He'd relax away, letting his mind run free, although it would often noodle back in a much more relaxed way to what he'd been focusing on previously. When Edison would fall asleep, the ball bearings would drop and clatter to the ground just as with Dali, and it would wake Edison up, and off he'd go with his ideas from the diffuse mode, ready to take them into the focus mode and build on them. So the bottom line is, when you're learning something new, especially something that's a little more difficult, your mind needs to be able to go back and forth between the two different learning modes. That's what helps you learn effectively. You might think of it as a bit analogous to building your strength by lifting weights. You would never plan to compete in a weightlifting competition by waiting until the very day before a meet and then spending that entire day working out like a fiend. I mean, it just doesn't happen that way. To gain muscular structure, you need to do a little work every day, gradually allowing your muscles to grow. Similarly, to build neural structure, you need to do a little work every day, gradually allowing yourself to grow a neural scaffold to hang your thinking on. A little bit every day, and that's the trick. In summary then, we learned that analogies provide powerful techniques for learning. We learned about how the brain's two different thinking modes, focused and diffuse, each helps us learn, but in very different ways. And finally, we learned that learning something difficult can take time. Your brain needs to alternate its ways of learning as it grapples with and assimilates the new material. Thanks for learning about learning. I'm Barbara Oakley.